Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome back. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein. This is Valley Beth Shalom, online Torah study for a Shabbos and a Sukkot morning. Joined this morning by my friend and teacher, Rabbi Marc Gellman from South Florida. Marc, good morning. Good to have you here.
My friend.
This morning is Shabbat Sukkot. And on Sukkot, on the holiday of Sukkot, on Shabbat, it is traditional to open a very extraordinary book of the Hebrew Bible, the book of Kohelet, in English, the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, as we read this book, and we're going to learn about it this morning, I want to take us back to the discussion that Rabbi Gellman and I left you with last week. We were talking about the quality of simcha. Sukkot, this holiday, is Zman Simchatenu, the time of our joy, of our celebration, of our happiness. But at the same time, we're sitting in a sukkah. And the symbolism, the visceral, physical symbolism of a sukkah is impermanence. A sukkah is not allowed to be built too firmly. It's got to be a little shaky. And the top is covered with schach, with leaves, so that the sunlight and the weather can enter into our sukkah. The whole idea of the holiday is to get us outside of these climate-controlled, artificially lit environments where we think we control things, and get us outside to feel the transitory nature, of the natural world, and ourselves as bodies in space, bodies in that natural world, subject to the laws and the changes and the cycles of nature. And the question we left you with last week, which I think is the deepest question of this holiday, is in what sense, how do you have a simcha, how do you have joy if you're living in a world which is always changing, you're living a life which is fragile, a life which is temporary, a life which is somewhat tentative, and the combination of those two ideas, the sort of contradiction, the oxymoron between the impermanence symbolized by the sukkah, and the demand, ach sameach, be a happy person on this holiday. That's the contradiction, and that's precisely what brings us to this book of Kohelet. Now, there's one of the questions we'll ask at the end of our conversation today is, who let this book into the Bible? Because it is a very controversial, very radical treatment of this question, far from the kind of traditional answers that you would expect to find in your Hebrew Bible. At the very end, in fact, the book was so radical that somebody added 3 extra verses to the very end, which are clearly not written by the author of the book, in which he says, yeah, nevertheless, live a Jewish life. Because the book itself is in some ways a broadside attack on the whole Jewish approach to life and the whole Jewish approach to religion. Let's take a look at this book together. You can find it in any Hebrew Bible at the end of the Bible in the section called Ketuvim, the writings. It's one of the 5 Megillot, one of the 5 scrolls that are read on Jewish holidays. And there's several wonderful translations now and wonderful commentaries on this book. And I recommend, whoop, wrong one. I recommend them to you. Let me find where I put Kohelet. Just one moment, sorry. And I think that it is the kind of book, it is a kind of book that will challenge all of our assumptions of what religion is teaching. So here we are. It begins with an identification. The words of Kohelet, son of David, king in Jerusalem. So the writer of this book is coming off as King Solomon. That was the son of King David in Jerusalem. And the reason he's coming off as Solomon is because Solomon had 2 qualities that made him an outstanding subject to explore this question. Solomon was the wisest of all men, and he was the richest of all men. So if there was anybody in the world positioned to ask the question, what is the meaning and purpose of life? Where do I find satisfaction in my life? How do I live a life which will give me what I want out of the world? It's the man who's the richest man in the world, who's also the wisest man in the world. And it begins with an overture. When you think about the beginning of Beethoven's 5th Symphony, an overture which draws us in right away. Utter futility, said Kohelet, utter futility. Some translations call it vanity. The Hebrew word is hevel. Hevel means mist. Here in Los Angeles, we have a weather report, which we hear most mornings, especially in the summertime. Early morning, low clouds and fog burning off by noon. And that's Hevel. So Kohelet begins by saying, everything in life is like Hevel. Everything in life is ephemeral. It's going to pass away. It's ethereal. It has no substance to it. It has no staying power. In the words of religion, it is impermanent. What real value is there for a man, for a person, in all we gain beneath the sun? Now here, the language of value and gain are important because the Hebrew is yitaron. Yitaron literally means profit with an F, not the kind you read in the Bible, but the kind you read with your accountant. And it's an accountant's asked question. If I take a ledger and I ask myself, what can I invest myself in life such that when I subtract the fact of death, the fact of my finitude, my limitation as a human being, the few years I'm living in the world, what's left? Is there anything that one can invest himself in? Is there anything that I can value that will get me past death, that will be permanent, that will be lasting, that will be in some ways eternal in the world? And that's what he's looking for. And he tells you right at the beginning, I don't think I'm going to find it. And that's what the opening overture is about. He says, when I looked, and I looked everywhere to find that, yitaron, to find X minus death equals what? One generation goes, another comes, the earth remains the same forever. The sun rises, the sun sets, and glides back to where it rises, southward blowing, turning northward, ever turning, blows the wind. All streams flow into the sea. The sea's never filled. From the place they flow, the streams go back again. It's just weary. Only that has happened, which has happened. Only that occur, which is kind of, there's nothing new beneath the sun. Famous line. Sometimes we say, hey, look, this is new. Nah, it's not. It happened early. It happened before. And nothing that anyone ever created before was ever really remembered. And then he gives you, this is what the book is going to be about. Here's his introduction. I, Kohelet, was king in Jerusalem. I set my mind to study and probe with wisdom all that happens under the sun. An unhappy business, he says, right? I tested with wisdom. And what he's going to do is do a series of tests. And he's going to go look at everything that human beings value, everything that human beings pursue. And he's going to ask himself, if I pursue that, will I have something in my life which is of value? What he's looking for is an answer to the greatest of human fears, the fear of oblivion. And I mentioned this on the holidays. It's the reason people write their names on giant buildings. It's the reason the kid tags the freeway sign. It's the reason the athlete wants to be the greatest of all time. It's the reason all of us do the things that we do in order to achieve some sense of our lasting value in the world. And Kohelet says, is there anything? And he's going to test. He's going to do 4 tests. He's going to test pleasure. He's going to test wealth. He's going to test wisdom. And he's going to test what he calls righteousness or devotion, religion. And in each case, he finds it doesn't work. Pleasure comes and goes. Money you can have, but you can't take it with you. Wisdom you can have, but the fool lives a better life than the wise person. I mean, I've said frequently that my dog lives a happier life than me because he doesn't watch CNN at night. And righteousness, he says, you know, the same fate is in store for the righteous and for those who live a life which is so much less. And then he says, therefore, I have found nothing. I have found nothing which can survive death, can survive mortality, can survive our finitude. I have found no answer to this great question of impermanence in human life. And then he says, I have my answer. And his answer will be familiar to you because it comes in a poetic form and in a prose form. The poetic form you all know from popular music. To everything there is a time and a season for every purpose under heaven, a time to be born, a time to die, a time to experience all of the moments of life. And in his prose version of this, I'll put it up so we can look at it together. In the prose version, he says, Go eat your bread in gladness and drink your wine in joy. For your action was long ago approved by God. Let your clothes be washed. Let your head never lack ointment. Enjoy happiness with a woman you love. I apologize for the sexism. All the fleeting days of your life. For that alone is what you get out of life. And whatever it is in your power to do, do with all your might. For there's no action, no reasoning, no learning, no wisdom. There's nothing to be gained when you die. Invest yourself in the experiences of life. And that's what life offers you. So let's begin with that. Marc, last week we talked about simcha as a quality of joy in the face of limitation, quality of joy in the face of impermanence. And here you have a full-blown philosophical exploration, an inquiry, sort of an interrogation of that very idea. And I know you've been a long-time student of Buddhism. Where does this fit? Is this a parallel? Is this an answer, a conversation with the Buddhist tradition?
Amen. I think, yes, it is. Look, I've been searching ever since I started my study of Buddhism in the 70s. And I thought, actually, until I wrote in the Department of Philosophy, my PhD, I thought my doctorate would be in comparative religions, in a comparison between Judaism and Buddhism. But I left that. But I studied Theravadan Buddhism, which was the old form, the form that was created by the Buddha, by Sakyamuni in Nepal. And as opposed to the Mahayana tradition that flourished in China and then had other branches. And I've been searching my whole life because I believed then, and I am certain now, that there was contact between Buddhism and Judaism. I was at the meeting with the Dalai Lama. The person who organized it was my friend, Marc, and he said it was the first time, a Buddha had met a rabbi, and I don't think that's true. So maybe rabbis, but it's not the first contact. And the proof that there was contact was, first of all, the Buddha and Kohelet, whoever the author was. It certainly wasn't Solomon. Scholars are clear on that. And date Kohelet somewhere between 450 and 200 before the Common Era. That's the scholarly judgment on it. The Buddha was alive at that time. The time of the Buddha was about 563 to 483. So it's the same, they were alive at the same time. There were trade routes, which the richest man in the world would have known, because that's where he got his spices, that came from Nepal through Afghanistan to Iraq and down to Damascus and then down into Israel on the trade routes that went continuously to the sea, then around the sea to Egypt. That was the King's Highway. And so there was a possibility of contact. There was a motive for contact. And here is the final thing. The teaching of Buddhism is distilled into the famous fourfold noble truths. That's the foundation of Buddhism. And it is exactly the teaching of Kohelet. Exactly, not somewhat like it, but it's exactly like it. And here it is. The first noble truth of Buddhism is called Dukkha, which means suffering. It's exactly what you just beautifully describe as hevel. It means nothing is substantial. Nothing has its own nature. We live in a world where nothing is real. And that's called samsara. The second noble truth, so that's identical. The second, which is identical between Buddhism and Kohelet, is the second noble truth, which is samudaya, which is the source of suffering. What is the source of this suffering? The suffering is, according to Buddhism, tanha. It's attachment to the world. Because like we fall in love with someone and they die, and that causes us suffering. We have money, but we lose it and that causes us suffering. Or we die and it gets inherited by some worthless heir who doesn't work for it and doesn't know what it's worth. So tanha is attachment, same identical thing. Third noble truth is how do you get rid of dukkha? And that's through what's called in Buddhism tanha kaya, the elimination of attachment. And that's what the entire book of Kohelet is about. Learning to not be attached to the seductions of the world. Don't be attached to wealth, as you said, to pleasure, to wisdom, which is a brilliant point of his. The making of many books, there is no end. A very striking critique of intellectualism, and righteousness, meaning whether you're good or bad, you're going to die. And so that's identical, that it's by renouncing our attachment to these ephemeral, insubstantial, unsatisfying seductions of the world that we can release ourselves from suffering. And the fourth noble truth, which is identical to Kohelet and made me totally change my view about Kohelet, because like you and every student who ever studied this book, we were always taught, well, you know, after his cynicism, the last two verses are, but in the end, follow God's words and do it because it happens to everyone. And that was supposed to make the book kosher. No, I think it's the highest truth. And that is what's called in Buddhism marga, which is the path. And we call it halakha. And the Muslims, who I think also benefited from the Buddhist teaching, they call it sha'ariyah. It's also in Taoism, the Tao is a path. So the notion that the way out of all this is to live a life on a path where it's a mean between extremes, where you're not attached to things, where you understand the ephemeral nature of existence. And that's what the Buddha achieved through meditation and by renouncing physical connections almost to the point of death. And that's what he learned. So here we have it, Eddie, an identical replication of the fourfold noble truths of Buddhism in the Torah and in the Tanakh. And so it shows us that there was cultural fertilization, syncretism. And I've talked many times in our teachings about the other moment, which was in 133, when Alexander the Great came through with his tutor Aristotle, and the rabbi said, "Oh my God, matter and form, body and spirit. We can now have a name for the immaterial nature of our existence, our neshama, which doesn't die and which goes on forever because it's not material, and therefore we have an olam haba, world to come, and death is not the end of us." And that eventually, that answer was, let's say, 200-300 years after Kohelet's death. And so here we have it, a connection between Buddhism and Judaism that is not just similar, but identical.
Mm-hmm. So the question is, the question that he asks doesn't belong to Buddhism, it belongs to all human beings.
All of us, yeah.
It's our response to knowing what it means to be human as you grow and mature and you realize how fragile the world we live in, how fragile our lives are, how fragile are the structures of meaning we create. And the question is, well, how do you live a satisfying life knowing that fragility, in the face or the shadow of that fragility? Which is why, by the way, something, again, we spoke about a bit last week, about why Sukkot comes right after Yom Kippur. Because Yom Kippur is the day in which we truly confront that fragility. We truly are rehearsing death. We're looking squarely at our own limitations, our own finitude, our mortality. And the question is, then you retreat back and you have a day of simcha, or holiday of simcha, a long holiday of simcha. And the question then is, how do you build a satisfying life given the fragility, the mortality, the limitations that we all learned about and really internalized on Yom Kippur. So the question, here's my question, Marc.
Yeah.
So I think that the parallels between the Buddha and Kohelet are remarkable and important. I think you're probably right that along the trade routes, philosophical ideas were being traded, texts were being traded. There's no reason to assume that we were a sealed off community. The question is the question that we all ask. And the answer that Kohelet gives, as well as the answer that the Buddhist tradition gives, is to withdraw from those attachments and therefore not to be trapped by them into the grief, into a sense, a constant sense of grief of having losing and losing and losing things. The question is that an answer? Is that a satisfying answer? Does it work as an answer?
It does. And I give only one example of many that I could give from the structure of the Sukha. I take as this example that you might consider the structure of the Shiva service, Eddie. All right? Jewish mourning practices. What's the point of all of it? What's the point of all of it? It's to get the mourner up and out, right? Up and out, so that they don't sit there and fixate on the death of the one they love forever and ever and ever and destroy their life. It says, good, you mourn, we'll be with you, you'll be crying, we'll be with you while you cry, we'll be sitting with you, and then you have to get up and you have to walk around the block and show to people that you are ready to go back to your regular life, and then you renounce a life of continuous grief. And so that's just another example of how the marga, the halakha, the path, the way is to go through life. It's not so simple as to say we engage in life and Buddhists renounce this life. That's not true. We're all in it, but we don't become so attached to it that it prevents us from understanding that we are essentially spiritual beings trapped in a body, and that's an unnatural state. And eventually, when our body separates from our spirit, we assume our natural state, which is as spirits that are capable of moving between existences. For the Buddhas, the Buddha can come back, and they call that returned Buddha after they achieve nirvana, a bodhisattva. That's what the Dalai Lama is, and other returned Buddhas. And we call it tzaddikim, but the concept is, Sukkot reminds us that our gashmiut, our physicality, is the least important part of us, because it involves us in a world that is transient and broken, and that the true simcha, and now I have a new translation for simcha, my friend, enlightenment. Zman simchatenu, the time of our enlightenment.
Okay.
And our enlightenment is to love a good piece of fish, to love another person, to love our children, to love wisdom, righteousness, but to love it not in a stupid, foolish way in which it's all we care about. I mean, I'm back to football. I'm deeply involved in the fate of the Dodgers because I'm a baseball guy. And there's a beautiful race in the National League West. And I look at the fans screaming and yelling and screaming. And I think, yeah, I'm in it too. But that's just a little too much. It's a little too much because it's only a game. It's only a game.
So what you're saying, Marc, is that the problem of being a human being, which is the problem of living a life that is satisfying and joyful in the face of our impermanence, is a problem that we all understand. I think all human beings understand, from the first very primitive human beings who sketched, who etched pictures on cave walls, in burial places. We've all understood this. It was best articulated at the same time in the 3rd century BCE by the Buddha and by Kohelet. And you're suggesting that 2 centuries later, when Aristotle shows up, right? Or that's 2 centuries, a century later, when Aristotle shows up.
Well, 2 really.
And the Jewish community adopts this idea of soul as the essence of human being. We find an answer. We find an answer because we can embrace the immortality of a soul, the permanence of soul, while we're recognizing the impermanence, the transience of body. So the problem articulated by the Buddha for us and articulated by Kohelet is then solved, or rather addressed, by Aristotle and by adopting the Rabbi's idea of olam haba, of a life of the soul. I think that's a very interesting. That's
my take.
A very interesting history of the biggest Jewish ideas there are. Let me propose just a slight variation. I really appreciated, first of all, your love of the Dodgers, of course, but I really appreciated the way you articulated that. It's a brilliant way of articulating it. If you ask most people, where do you invest yourself to gain a sense that life is worth living? What most people would tell you is in family, in the circle of people I'm with, in the community I'm with, in my friends, in the circle of friends. And when I look back at Kohelet, one of the things I miss in Kohelet is a social context. Kohelet is a lonely man. And one of the ways of reading Kohelet is that the whole book is in some ways a commentary on the biblical idea articulated, we'll read it in a couple of weeks in Genesis, Lo tov he'ot adam levado. It's not right to live alone. Look, he takes these experiments, right? He says, pleasure. What good is pleasure? You feel it today. It's good to be pleasure. It's nice to have pleasure. It's better to have pleasure than to have pain. He says, it's fine, but that's not going to get you past mortality. Except if you share it with somebody, it's a different experience. It's one thing to go to dinner. It's a whole other thing to go to dinner with my wife. Then it becomes something else. A sacred meal is a meal in which life is shared, not just the pleasure of the food. Wealth, it's wonderful to have wealth. Much better to have wealth than poverty. But wealth can be used to share life in certain ways, to enhance life in certain ways. Wisdom, the same thing. And the same thing with righteousness. I mean, one of the scary lines in the book is he says, alongside righteousness, there's wickedness. Well, the question is, and what did you do about it? The wickedness that you witnessed in the world didn't call on you. It didn't claim you to respond in some manner. You're the richest man in the world, and you didn't find anything untoward about poverty, about want, about disease in the world. You could have done something with it. And then the biggest irony of the book, which I just love, is when he says wisdom, but think for a second. A guy writes a book and his first line in the book is, nothing ever lasts except for one thing. We're reading his book. Why write a book if nothing ever changes in the world? You write a book because you think that you can materially change the lives of people by sharing your insights and your wisdom. And the irony is the guy who said there's nothing you can do in the world to achieve immortality. We're reading his book. We're reading his book 2,500 years after he lived. He's achieved, if not a personal immortality, a certain immortality of influence, an immortality of his moral vision. So I think that one of the ways that the Jewish tradition, I'm not disagreeing with you, by the way, because I think that your observation is very deep. But I think one of the other ways that the Jewish tradition responded to the challenge that Kohelet and the Buddha places in front of us is, yes, my life is transitory, but my family's life, the community's life, the life of the learning community that I've gathered around me, that lasts. That lasts. Ein hatzibur met. The community doesn't die. The social context gives me a way of transcending death.
Yeah, o chevruta o matuta.
Right.
Give me community or give me death.
Right. Friendship.
Yeah, I love yours is a purely Jewish response, brilliantly Jewish response. It reflects your good and deep soul, your loving nature. But let me.
There's a however coming. I hear it. Here it comes, Eddie. Here it comes. Hold on.
No, not but. This is not however.
However.
And.
Okay.
And I want you to consider the Buddha. And I want you to consider his path.
Mhm.
He was exactly like Kohelet.
Yeah.
He was lonely. He was alone. And I want you to consider the dark side, the pain, the Dukkha side, the Hevel side of a loving marriage and a loving family.
Absolutely.
Well, let me just lay it out, which is, and I just had a counseling session this week with a daughter so in love with her mother, so connected to her mother, unbelievably connected in the real Jewish way, calling 3 times a day. And she mother died of a cancer quickly. And the daughter, who's a control freak, can't handle it, cannot deal with it, can't deal with it. All she wants is her mother not to be dead anymore. And that's the other side. The other side is the more you love someone, the more you love your family, the more you love your wife, the more your husband, your partner, the more you love someone, the more pain you have when they die.
Right.
When I counsel people in grief, I tell them a true Gellmanism, which is something that you wouldn't figure is true, but is true. And then I say, every morning, I want you to get up. I want you to say this prayer. Dear God, thank you for the pain. And they say, oof, oof. I said, no, hear me out. If you didn't love that person as deeply as you did, you could wake every morning with much less pain. So the fact that you have so much pain is absolute evidence that you love them deeply. And you should thank God that you were able to commit yourself, despite the chevel nature of things, the fact that we all die, that you were able to trade the eventual pain for the love that you had. I end my Olam Haba lecture, and I ended it at your place, and usually ended with an argument Peter Berger made in his book, A Rumor of Angels, about lullabies as a proof for the existence of God. That we sing lullabies to children. And what do they all say in different words? Don't worry, shashtil, it'll be all right. Everything will be good. Well, guess what? The real lullaby, the truthful lullaby is, guess what, kid, you're going to die. I'm going to die probably before you. You're going to be in terrible grief. Everything you love is going to die, and you're going to die. Well, you can't tell a kid that. So the truth is, we need to sing lullabies to give us hope in the face of the impermanence of life. What Kohelet has and what the Buddha had is something that is breathtaking. It's spiritual and intellectual courage. They had the courage to say, look, you've just been through a joyous holiday. You've had beautiful food. You've had wonderful challahs. You've greeted Ushpizin. You've had everything you want, and you've been forgiven for your sins, and you should feel really good. Well, guess what? Guess what? It's time for me to tell you the truth. The truth is that it's all going away. It's all going to go away. And so that journey of human finitude, Eddie, it's a lonely journey. And I don't think we go through it with anyone else, no matter how much we love them. We go through it alone. The Buddha went through it alone. Kohelet went through it alone. Kierkegaard went through it alone. Camus went through it alone. Sartre went through it alone. The great wisdom is that we know we're alone, but we still embrace what we can, what's given to us to embrace, knowing that it's impermanent. It doesn't mean that we're happy about slavery and we don't want to change the world. That's the simple-minded, ignorant description of the difference between Judaism and Buddhism. Buddhism doesn't care about changing the world. We do. We have tikkun. No. Gandhi changed the world, and he was a Hindu. I mean, the Buddha changed the world. I believe that the way we change the world in a Kohelet Buddha form is by making ourselves incompatible with falsehood. We make ourselves incompatible with falsehood. We don't accept bromides about things. We don't believe in things that are embroidered on a pillow or put on a wall for inspiration. No, we understand that there is a deep and profound mystery awaiting us after death. And that mystery may be nothing, because let's not forget, the Buddhist answer is different than the Jewish answer in that they do not have a personal God. But on the other hand, you tell me what the Jewish view of God is after we die and what Olam Haba is. I describe Olam Haba, and the failure of my lecture is that I think people believe I'm describing Disney World. You know, it's not a place. It's a mystery about what happens to an unfettered soul.
Right.
What happens to a soul that is no longer in need of physical sustenance or emotional sustenance, but is pure and made out of the same thing that God is made out of. That's nirvana. That's enlightenment. And I believe that the greatest ones are given the freedom, the privilege, the zechut, to return to earth and teach this lesson. Some of them become rabbis, some of them become golfers, almost all of them live in Florida, some of them root for the Dodgers, others root for other teams that are not at all as worthy. And that's the way it is, Eddie. That's my view about loneliness.
I appreciate that. I really appreciate that. And I'm not gonna, it's not an argument. I want to add a different voice to this. You know, there's a beautiful story. There's a woman named Sylvia Boorstein, who's a wonderful teacher of meditation. The story is she's a Jewish lady who lives in California, Northern California, and she lost a grandchild and looked for solace after the loss of a grandchild, which is devastating. And she found it in Buddhist life, and she became a tremendous teacher of Buddhism. Tremendous teacher of Buddhism. But she talks in her book, she has a book called Funny You Don't Look Buddhist. She talks about it, so she got to a certain point in the depths of her Buddhist meditation where she realized that she couldn't detach herself from her profound love for her grandchildren. So, like she was a Buddhist, but she was a bubby before she was a Buddhist. And I think that there's something profoundly Jewish in that, Marc.
Yes, I do too.
That the place where the two traditions separate is this idea that in investing myself in the love of the people I'm with, in the love of the community I'm with, there's something of eternity in that. Heschel's notion of an echo of eternity in certain moments, in certain encounters. Buber's idea of an I thou as a revelation of God. You know, a guy comes and talks to me, he says, my kids want to get a dog. I said, get the kids a dog. He says, you know, it's a mess. I said, yeah, it's a pain, but it's a mess, but the kids will love the dog. It's good for the kids. And then he looks at me, he says something very profound. He says, but Rabbi, you know, dog's going to die one day. It's going to make them very unhappy. This interesting Buddhist question about a dog. Should you get the dog knowing that your kids are going to be made unhappy on the day that the dog leaves you, whenever years it is from now? And I said, but you're going to have moments of eternity in the joy that you have with this dog in your house. And you'll find a way through the grief. And I think that investment in those moments is itself a way of touching eternity. The question of a soul, I think, is a brilliant way of articulating it. But just the phenomenon of feeling eternity in those relationships and the closeness. A Jewish story that answers the Buddhist story is the horrifying death of Rabbi Akiva. It's described in the Talmud and Shabbos, Talmud Shabbat. You know, and he's being tortured to death, and he's smiling, and the students ask him why he's smiling. And he says, because I always thought I would love God with my heart and soul, and now I can love God with all my might. And what you realize is that he's teaching. In his death, he's teaching. His immortality is in the connection he has with his students, in the truth that he's able to share. He may himself expire. He's going to leave the world as a bodily and may live in the world. There's an answer that says he goes to Olam Haba, but there's another answer that says on the day that Rabbi Akiva dies, Rabbi Yehuda is born. His Torah goes on living. I think that the Jewish answer is to invest ourselves in the world, knowing it's going to hurt us, because that's the only place to find eternity in this existence. That, I think, is why it's man simchatenu. And when Kohelet says, do it with all your might, that, by the way, is a very Jewish answer, because, you know, every one of us eats a cupcake and then feels guilty about it for a week, right? You know, if you just enjoy it, invest yourself in the moments of life, particularly in the relationships of the people you love. And in that, you'll find the eternity that you're seeking. I think it's a different answer than the Buddhist answer. It's not completely different. It's a commentary, a gloss on it.
No, it's saying, I embrace the hevel.
I embrace the love despite the hevel. I embrace, because in love,
the love is hevel. But you're saying, I think it's too strong an argument to say it's an eternity that you're embracing. I think what's more accurate to your beautiful way of saying the difference, and I think you're exactly right about the difference, is to say, we accept that it's hevel.
mm-hmm.
But hevel isn't nothing. Hevel is something that is not eternal.
Impermanent, right.
Impermanent, but it's still something.
It's still
and
something.
We're embracing the hevel.
Yeah.
The Buddhist is no, because it brings you pain. Right. And for the Buddhist, the idea is to get rid of the pain. The Jewish idea is, no, you know what? I'm accepting the pain.
Sit in the Tsuka.
I'm accepting the pain.
Right.
And that's why Rabbi Akiva was smiling.
Right.
Because he didn't feel the pain, because he was accepting what he was doing as a gift of his life, a sacrifice of his life to God. And that's what sacrifice is. It's a sacrifice of complete love. So, but I think both are true in the sense that the Buddha came back and taught people, even though he didn't need to come back. He was essentially dead. He was essentially gone. His spirit, his Atma was gone. And even in Buddhism, they have a debate of Atma or Anatma. That is your soul, is that thing in you, is it Cheva, or is your soul something substantial? And what happened is that the Buddhist tradition that followed the Buddha could not live with the purity of the Theravadan tradition, which was Anatma, no, there's no soul, there's no God. And so that's where you have Lamaism, and you have the Buddhist statues where they offer fruit and things and shrines. They needed something visible and tangible in order to run Buddhism. And they still have that. So both of us, both Judaism and Buddhism, face the choice. But the point is, it's the same choice. And the point is that the solution is the same solution.
Well, Marc, thank you. This has been great. I want to recommend to everybody today, Shabbat, open up the Tanakh, find the book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, at the end of the Bible. It's very short, it's 10 chapters. Read through it, at least read through the first 7 chapters. It's a remarkable reflection on the truth of life. And I think you'll find it really enlightening. And you'll understand why this book engages the two of us to such a deep extent.
And then study Buddhism. So read a book about the Buddha.
Or Judaism, which is good too.
Karen Armstrong's book's a good one on the Buddha, and there's others. Ishi Yamada's book on the Buddha is good. There's lots of things you can read, but now what I discovered is that they met. And before I met in New Jersey, the Dalai Lama, and he became friendly and wrote forwards to our book and our HBO special. He got animated along with me and with Tommy. It was a remarkable thing.
Animation,
and so maybe that's why I'm here, to kind of, maybe I'm a reincarnation of Kohelet. I don't know.
You're a bridge builder between two ancient
between the two, East and West. Between Catholicism and Judaism. Maybe that's what my life was always about.
And golf.
Oh, and golf and baseball. I mean, what else is there except a stuffed cabbage maybe once in a while. That Sukkot, you got to eat some chalupchas for Sukkot. And
Anyway, thank you all very, very much.
yeah,
Following this, we'll be davening for Shabbos, of course. And then this week, on Monday night, the holiday begins again. Tuesday morning is Shmini Atzeret. That morning, we'll have services here on VBS online at 10 o'clock, at 9:30 in the morning. The Yizkor prayers will be recited at about 11:15 that morning. Tuesday night is Simchat Torah. Here at VBS, we're going to be having a festival of Jewish storytelling and song for little kids at 5 o'clock, for everybody else, older kids and grown-ups at 7 o'clock. Invite you to come down. We'll be outside, masked, so it's going to be very safe. Or you can watch us here online. Wonderful storyteller Karen Golden is coming, and wonderful musician Craig Taubman. So please join us for that. And then Wednesday morning, the end of the holiday season with Simchat Torah. Hope that you're having a very good week. Shabbat Shalom, a sweet and happy Shabbos. Marc, thank you.
happy Sukkot.